Hi, thanks for joining me again. I was marking up some of the charts last night for the ASX weekly chart analysis, and I noticed that I'd been putting a little green box to denote buying around the ASX Financials chart for weeks and weeks. I've been marking this little box that was showing that buying took place in this little period here. And this week, we saw price break out above resistance, and it's mostly in response to this buying that we saw previously, many weeks ago actually. It's probably dragged out a little longer than it should have, owing to coronavirus issues and perhaps the uncertainty around the US federal election. And help this week was also that there was the announcement of a vaccine that may help in the coronavirus issue. Now, if we go back and let's look at this chart. I've been looking at it for weeks and weeks, so I know it pretty well. But all of this was when coronavirus was first causing problems. And at some point, value is found in the market, and some buying came in here. Now, I've mentioned this before. I think there's even a video earlier on about why this represents buying. But effectively, there was quite a bit of volume going through. Price didn't fall. If price is not falling and lots of volumes going through, someone must be buying. So even though there is price compression here and some of the bars look as though they're not very positive, the buyers were in there quietly absorbing the supply, and here was your response. Price pushed higher. We mark this as the high of the range. There was an attempt here to absorb the supply that was coming in preparation for a breakout. But the combination of coronavirus and a lack of demand, if you look down here, you can see volumes are actually falling off. They're not increasing. There's a lack of demand in the market, uncertainties there. So price wasn't able to break out. It wasn't strong enough for whatever reason. So I started cascading lower again. This is a regular response. This was like a shakeout of this previous period because for whatever reason, price wasn't able to break out and it was stalled at resistance. You can see it stalled at this line for weeks and weeks. So price pushes lower in an attempt to challenge any sellers in the market, sell their positions, which will release the brakes, so to speak, and allow price to move higher when demand resumes again. Now let's clear all that off. Now you can see price was moving lower here, and volume wasn't particularly high. But then this bar here comes in on an increase in volume. There was some extra volume from expiry day on the Thursday, but there's no doubt that spread narrowed considerably over the previous bars. And if this increase in volume was all selling, you could have only expected price to continue lower with, on an increase in volume, an increase in spread. But instead, spread reduced considerably. It's at least half or less of the previous bar's spread and the ones prior to that as well. And then the next bar closed higher. Now you have to think about it. How could the spread narrow on this, the volume increase, and the next bar be higher, if this was all selling in here. It couldn't have been all selling. There must have been quiet support in the market on the increase in volume. It wasn't loud and brash buying, it was quiet support sitting in the market, absorbing the supply at this level. And then the next bar, my way of reading it, it's a weekly chart, was that the cascade was allowed to continue. So the cascade continued lower. Price was then below the low of the previous bar, which tests the market for supply. And then there was, at some point during the week, a buy the offer situation where all of the offer was bought up to a certain level, up to this level. And then in response, the next week sees price dip lower again on reduced volume. It's showing that supply is now not in the market. There's less supply in the market. The sellers that were present back over here have been absorbed and supply has reduced. If supply is reduced, as soon as there's any sort of decent demand in the market, like the next week, on average volume, price breaks out above the high of this buy the offer bar. That was just telling you that this was a clearly readable pattern. It was clearly understandable. Buying support, buy the offer, test the market for supply, break out on average volume or slightly below average volume with a wide spread. There was only a wide spread on this bar with very low volume because there was no more sellers in the market. It was all buyers. And that small amount of buying or average amount of buying caused price to accelerate higher and break out above the high of the buy the offer bar. And it continued for another week before price stalled a little. And remembering that is where we're marking the high of the range. Price stalled a little. This was a little bit of a concern. Price dipped lower with an increased spread on increased volume. But when the next bar closed higher and back towards the highs of the range, it obviously wasn't going to be too much of an issue. Now we'll clear all that off and just make it a bit more easier to see. It's quite obvious now that there was buying on these two bars, and this was a test of the market, and this was the breakout above the buying. And unless this line was threatened and or the lows of this range were threatened, you're pretty safe in your trade, and you got a good response, and it's likely to continue higher yet. Although price may test the breakout for strength before it does continue higher. Now, how could you use this, seeing this is actually the financial sector? What you would do is go and have a look at the constituents that make up this sector and see if you can find evidence that supports this happening in the market. Now, I can be pretty sure in telling you that this chart is almost the same as each of the big four banks charts. They're slightly different, but generally the same. And what you'd be doing is looking for one that matches this little setup very clearly. This was a clear and understandable setup, and you could use this to your advantage in that market. So you need a little detective work to go through and find a chart that matched, and then trade that to your advantage. Okay, that's just about it for me today. Can I just say that if anyone wants to post any of my videos on other media, they're quite welcome. Thanks for that. See ya.